A millionaire pays his secretary to give birth to his child. After giving birth, the woman suddenly received a call from the rhythmic hum of keyboards and the soft murmur of phones filled the sprawling office on the 32nd floor of the Powell Tower. Haley Ward sat at her desk, her fingers gliding across the keys as she composed yet another flawless email. The skyline of Manhattan sprawled behind her, its glittering towers a world apart from the chaos she lived outside these walls. Her appearance was immaculate, hair pinned neatly, blouse pressed without a crease. But beneath the veneer, she was a woman held together by sheer will. Her occasional glance at her phone revealed a silent struggle, anticipating news, dreading its arrival, and desperately hoping for a call that never arrived. "Haley," came Mason Powell's clipped tone from the corner office. She turned toward him, her face composed. Mason leaned against his desk, the sharp lines of his tailored suit mirroring the precision of his movements. His presence exuded control, as if he could bend the world to his will if he willed it hard enough. "Yes, Mr. Powell?" she asked, stepping into his office. It was a fortress of glass and steel, reflecting the man himself, imposing, calculated, and utterly detached. Mason motioned to a file on his desk. "Run through these numbers for tomorrow's meeting with Lanchester. Their projections are optimistic, and I'd like to confirm where their reality lies." His gaze flicked to her, cool and assessing. "By noon." "Understood," Haley replied, her voice steady. She lifted the file, her fingers brushing the cool leather of the portfolio. Their eyes met briefly, his sharp and piercing, hers calm and unfazed. There was no small talk, no wasted words. It was one of the things Mason valued most about her. As she walked back to her desk, her phone vibrated. The screen lit up with the hospital's number. Her stomach knotted as she glanced at Mason's office. The blinds were down. He was already engrossed in whatever matter needed conquering next. She picked up. "Miss Ward, this is Nurse Daniels," came the voice on the other end. Haley's throat tightened. "There's no change in Mr. Ward's condition. We're just checking in to confirm the payment arrangements for this month." "I'll send it by the end of the day," Haley said, her voice sharper than she intended. She rubbed her temple as the call ended, the weight of the words pressing down on her. No change. It had been 3 years of the same refrain, 3 years of machines breathing for Billy, of sterile hospital rooms, of doctors' practiced sympathy. And she had carried it all. His care, her work, the suffocating weight of hope and its betrayal. The day blurred into numbers and deadlines. By the time the office emptied and the lights dimmed, Haley was still at her desk, her fingers trembling over the keyboard as she worked through another spreadsheet. It was past 8 when Mason's door opened, and his voice broke the silence. "Haley, a moment." She looked up, startled. His expression gave nothing away as he gestured for her to follow him inside. She rose, smoothing her skirt before stepping into the quiet sanctum of his office. Mason leaned against the edge of his desk, arms crossed. His sharp blue eyes studied her, calculating. "You're a remarkable employee, Haley," he began, his tone almost conversational, but with a weight beneath it. "Disciplined, discreet, reliable." "Thank you, Mr. Powell," she said, unsure where this was leading. "That's why I'm going to propose something unusual," he continued, his words precise, like a blade carving through glass. "Something that requires trust and your particular skill set." Haley stiffened. "Go on." Mason held her gaze. "I've decided to have a child. Not through the usual entanglements, a wife, the complications of romance, but through surrogacy. I need someone intelligent, capable, and trustworthy to carry my heir. You, Haley." The words hung in the air, cold and clinical. Haley blinked, certain she'd misheard. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low and sharp. "You heard me. Mason replied, unflinching. "I'm offering you financial security, a sum significant enough to address whatever burdens you may be carrying." Her breath caught as her mind raced. The hospital bills, the debt, Billy's machines humming endlessly. But the thought of this, of selling her body for another person's legacy, made her skin crawl. She stepped back. "This isn't a job, Mr. Powell. It's monstrous." Mason's expression didn't waver. "It's practical. I thought you, of all people, would understand that." Her hands curled into fists. "Practical? My husband is lying in a hospital bed, clinging to life, and you want me to—" She broke off, her voice cracking. "You have no idea what you're asking." Mason tilted his head slightly. "I know exactly what I'm asking, Haley. That's why I'm asking you." She stared at him, her chest heaving, a storm of emotions crashing within her. "You think money solves everything," she said, her voice cold. "It doesn't." She turned on her heel and left the office, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Mason didn't stop her. The door closed behind her with a heavy thud, but his words followed her into the night. In the elevator, she leaned against the wall, closing her eyes as tears threatened to fall. She clutched her bag tightly, her mind screaming at the impossible choice ahead. The city lights blurred as the elevator descended. Somewhere in the maze of it all, she would have to decide. The subway car rattled as Haley sat wedged between two strangers, her hands clasped tightly around the strap of her bag. The fluorescent lights above cast a sterile glow on her pale face, exaggerating the dark circles beneath her eyes. She stared ahead, unseeing, her mind locked in a cycle of memories and dilemmas. The train jerked to a halt at the hospital's stop. Haley stood, her legs stiff from the long ride. Outside, the air was damp and heavy with the smell of rain-soaked concrete. She adjusted her scarf against the chill, steeling herself for the familiar walk to the hospital. The automatic doors hissed open, and the sterile scent of antiseptic welcomed her like a familiar foe. "Good evening, Miss Ward," Nurse Daniels said, her voice kind but weary, as Haley approached the nurses' station. "Room 218, no changes today." Haley nodded. No changes. Always no changes. She made her way to Billy's room, her heels clicking softly against the linoleum. Inside, the room was quiet, except for the rhythmic beep of machines and the faint whoosh of the ventilator. Billy lay motionless on the hospital bed, his face slack but peaceful. Billy's chest rose and fell in perfect rhythm with the machine's breath. She pulled a chair to his bedside and sat, her hand reaching out to brush his fingers. His skin was warm, but unresponsive. "Hey," she said softly, her voice catching. "I'm here." Her gaze wandered to the photos taped to the wall, a younger Billy laughing in the sunshine, his arms slung casually over her shoulders, the two of them on their wedding day, their faces flushed with joy and champagne. She had once believed in forever, but the accident had stolen that promise, leaving her with a fractured reality and a mountain of responsibilities. Haley's head fell forward slightly, jerking her awake. She hadn't realized she'd dozed off, the weight of exhaustion too heavy to fight. A knock on the door startled her fully awake. "Ms. Ward," the doctor said as he entered, clipboard in hand. He offered her a tight smile before glancing at Billy. "I wanted to go over this month's expenses with you. I understand this isn't easy, but—" She nodded, bracing herself for what she already knew. The numbers didn't get smaller. They only grew. Therapy, medications, tests, the constant presence of machines, every beep and hum was a reminder of her ever-increasing debt. She thanked the doctor curtly, folding the invoice into her bag without looking at it. Back in the hallway, she leaned against the wall, her chest tightening. Around her, life bustled on. Nurses hurrying between rooms, visitors with flowers and balloons, faint laughter echoing from somewhere far off. She watched a young man push a wheelchair with an elderly woman who giggled at something he'd said. Hayley turned away. The sight stung too much. On her way home, she couldn't stop the memories from spilling into her mind. Billy's crooked smile as he balanced pancakes on a spatula, insisting breakfast in bed was his specialty. The warmth of his hand on her back as they danced in their tiny living room, music spilling softly from the record player. His whispered promises of adventures, Europe, road trips, a house by the sea. All of it had shattered in a moment. The car accident had stolen Billy's vitality, and in its place, it had left an endless maze of hospital corridors and bills she couldn't pay. That night, Hayley sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. She unfolded the hospital invoice and placed it beside the portfolio Mason had given her earlier that day. The numbers stared back at her, accusatory. She closed her eyes, her hands trembling as she rested her forehead against them. Mason's words echoed in her mind. "I'm offering you financial security, a chance to erase your burdens." His tone had been clinical and detached, yet the offer itself stood out as an unspoken promise of freedom. She pushed away from the table and paced the room. It wasn't freedom. It was a betrayal. Betrayal of her principles, of her vows to Billy. Yet every thought of refusal brought her back to the cold, unrelenting reality of his condition. If the machines stopped, so would Billy's life. What choice did she really have? Hayley sat awake in the dark hours of the morning, her fingers tracing the edge of her wedding ring. She had married Billy regardless of the circumstances, and this situation was beyond anything she could have anticipated. If Mason's offer was the price for keeping Billy alive, could she live with herself for paying it? Her reflection in the window stared back at her, hollow and searching. The streets below were quiet, the city resting for now. She reached for the phone. Her voice barely rose above a whisper when she called Mason. "I'll do it," she said, her words heavy with resignation. "I'll carry your child." Mason's response was calm, almost as if he'd expected this. "You made the right choice, Hayley. I'll have the arrangements set up immediately." When the call ended, she sat back in her chair, the phone slipping from her fingers. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. There was no room for breaking down now. Tomorrow, she would face Mason and sign the papers. Tonight, she let the guilt settle in. The office lights buzzed softly in the stillness of early morning, casting a stark glow over Mason Powell's sprawling desk. Hayley stood just outside his office door, her hand frozen on the polished metal handle. She had been here countless times before, delivering reports or taking instructions, but today was different. This was not a conversation about numbers or schedules. It was about the life growing within her and the life she was sacrificing for it. Drawing a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Mason was seated, his hands steepled under his chin. The minimalist room, with its angular furniture and grey tones, felt colder than ever. The windows framed the Manhattan skyline, the city bustling far below, but here, inside this office, the air felt as if it had stopped moving. "Hayley," Mason said, his voice even, as though they were about to discuss quarterly projections. He gestured for her to sit across from him. She took the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the HVAC system. Mason slid a sleek black folder toward her. "This outlines the terms," he began. "I'll ensure anonymity. All medical expenses will be covered. You'll stay in the guest house on my estate during the pregnancy. It's more efficient to have you close by for monitoring." Haley opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the meticulously prepared contract, the language clinical, every contingency accounted for. And after the birth, she inquired, her voice barely audible beyond a whisper. Mason leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on her. The child will be mine entirely. You'll have no legal or emotional ties. In return, you'll receive the agreed-upon compensation, deposited immediately after the birth. She felt the weight of his words settle over her like a shroud. There was no room for sentiment in this arrangement. To him, this was as transactional as acquiring a new property or merging with another company. "Do you have any questions?" Mason asked, his tone unchanged. Haley looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of humanity. There was nothing, only the same impassive mask he always wore. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" she said, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. "I wouldn't make the offer if I hadn't," Mason replied simply. Her fingers gripped the pen he had placed on the desk. She stared at it, the weight of her decision making it feel heavier than it should. "This isn't easy for me," she said, her voice tight, the first crack in her composure. Mason's expression shifted ever so slightly, an almost imperceptible flicker of something behind his icy exterior. "I know," he said, his voice softer. But did he? Could he ever understand the magnitude of what she was about to do? Haley signed the contract with trembling hands. The scratch of the pen on paper seemed deafening in the silent room. When she finished, she pushed the folder back toward Mason, her movements stiff. "Thank you, Haley," he said, his tone returning to its usual neutrality. She rose from her seat, clutching her bag like a lifeline. She turned toward the door, pausing only briefly to glance back at him. "You said this wasn't personal." "For me, it is," she said quietly before walking out. The guest house was as stark as the main office. White walls, sleek furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured gardens. Everything about it screamed luxury, but to Haley, it felt like a prison. Her belongings fit into a single suitcase, which sat untouched in the corner of the bedroom. She stood in the center of the room, the silence pressing in on her. The bed was larger than her entire apartment back in Queens, the linens crisp and pristine. She wandered to the window, staring out at the sprawling estate. The lawn stretched endlessly, interrupted only by sculpted hedges and fountains. Beyond that, she could make out the outline of the main house, a monolithic structure of glass and steel that mirrored Mason's personality, imposing and impenetrable. A soft knock at the door startled her. A woman in her 50s, dressed in a sharp navy suit, entered with a clipboard. "Ms. Ward, I'm Stephanie," the woman said, her professional smile never wavering. "I'll be your primary contact during your stay. If you need anything, groceries, additional clothes, adjustments to the schedule, just let me know." Haley nodded, her throat too tight to respond. Stephanie handed her a phone. "This is pre-programmed with all the necessary contacts. Mr. Powell has ensured you'll have everything you need." As Stephanie left, Haley sat on the edge of the bed, the phone heavy in her hand. Everything she needed, except the life she had left behind. That night, Haley lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was silent, save for the faint rustle of the wind outside. Her mind drifted to Billy, to the quiet hum of the machines keeping him alive. She thought of the doctor's steady voice, explaining the procedure Mason's money would make possible, of the faint hope that one day Billy might wake up. Her hand rested on her stomach, where a life that wasn't hers would soon begin to grow, a life that would give Billy another chance. The tears came slowly, silently, slipping down her temples as she whispered into the dark, "I hope you'll forgive me." The days at the estate blurred together. a routine of sterility and isolation. Haley woke each morning to the pale light filtering through the sheer curtains of her guest house bedroom. The staff arrived and departed with remarkable efficiency, delivering meals, providing medical updates, and politely inquiring about her needs. Yet, they never stayed long enough to engage in conversation. The space, though luxurious, was suffocating. The quiet was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning or the occasional chirp of a bird outside. Haley found herself pacing the long halls, her footsteps echoing on the polished wooden floors. The grandeur of the estate's high ceilings and sweeping views only amplified the emptiness she felt. One morning, unable to bear the silence, Haley sat at the desk in the corner of the guest house and opened a notebook. The pen felt awkward in her hand at first, but once she started writing, the words poured out. "Billy," she began. Her handwriting wavered as she described her life here. The coldness of the house, the distant staff, the ache of missing him. She wrote of her guilt and the impossible choice she'd made. The words came raw and honest, each one carving out a small piece of the weight she carried. "I tell myself, this is for you, that this is the only way. But sometimes I'm not sure I'll recognize myself when this is all over." When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer beside her bed. It joined 2 others she had written that week, small confessions to a man who couldn't read them. The days turned into weeks, and Haley's body began to change. The first flutter of life inside her was a shock, both beautiful and terrifying. She spent hours tracing her hands over her stomach, wondering about the tiny being growing there. It felt strange to bond with something she had no claim to, and the conflict gnawed at her. The evenings were the hardest. Alone in the guest house, Haley would sit by the window and watch the main house. Lights flickered in Mason's office late into the night, the shadow of his figure moving against the glass. Sometimes she imagined what he might be doing, poring over contracts, making calls, planning his empire. He had a way of being everywhere and nowhere, always looming yet strangely absent. One afternoon, Stephanie knocked on her door, clipboard in hand. "Miss Ward, it's time for your routine checkup. Dr. Redding is waiting in the main house," Stephanie said. Haley nodded, grabbing her notebook out of habit before following Stephanie across the estate grounds. The main house was even more intimidating up close, its towering glass facade reflecting the grey clouds above. Stephanie led her to a private medical suite tucked into one wing. Inside, Dr. Redding greeted her with a professional smile and began the usual routine: blood pressure, measurements, and updates on the baby's development. Mason appeared mid-appointment, his presence as commanding as ever. He exchanged a brief greeting with the doctor, his sharp eyes scanning the room before landing on Haley. "Everything looks good," Dr. Redding said, stepping aside to allow Mason a closer look at the ultrasound monitor. Haley shifted uncomfortably under Mason's gaze, clutching her notebook tighter. She felt exposed, as though this visit was more about ensuring the asset was on track than genuine concern for her well-being. "Good," Mason said, his voice calm and clinical. But as he turned to leave, his eyes caught the notebook in Haley's hands. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward it. Haley hesitated, her grip tightening. "Just something I've been writing. May I?" Mason's tone was unreadable, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his expression. She considered refusing, but felt too weary to argue. Handing the notebook to him, she watched as he flipped through the pages. His face remained impassive as his eyes scanned the words, but there was a brief pause when he reached the first letter addressed to Billy. "You write to your husband," he said, more a statement than a question. Yes, Haley replied softly. It helps to feel connected to him. Mason closed the notebook carefully and handed it back. For a moment, he looked at her differently, not as an employee or a vessel, but as a person. That must be difficult, he said, his voice quieter than usual. Haley met his gaze, surprised. For the first time, there was a crack in his armor, a glimpse of something almost human behind his usual stoicism. It is, she admitted. Mason nodded once, stepping back toward the door. If you need anything, let Stephanie know, he said, before leaving abruptly. That night, Haley sat by the window, the notebook open in her lap. She added a new letter to the growing collection. Billy, today, for the first time, I think he understood. It was fleeting, but it was there. Something like empathy. I don't know if it matters, but it made me feel less alone, even for just a moment. She folded the letter and placed it with the others, the act bringing her a sliver of comfort. Outside, the lights in Mason's office stayed on late, as always. But now, Haley wondered if perhaps the man inside wasn't as untouchable as he seemed. The first time Mason lingered after a routine checkup, Haley barely noticed. He stood near the window of the medical suite, hands clasped behind his back, his sharp profile silhouetted against the grey sky. The doctor finished explaining Haley's progress. Heart rate steady, growth on track. While Mason remained silent, his gaze seemingly fixed on the sprawling gardens outside. As the doctor left, Haley began to gather her things, expecting Mason to follow. But he didn't. Are you feeling all right? He asked, his voice clipped but quieter than usual. Haley hesitated, taken aback. Yes, she said, tucking her hair behind her ear. The doctor just said everything is fine. Mason nodded, but his gaze stayed on her for a beat longer than expected. Good. Let me know if that changes. It wasn't much, but the interaction marked the beginning of something unexpected. Over the next few weeks, Mason's visits became more frequent. He would arrive unannounced during her checkups, or stop by the guest house under the guise of discussing medical updates. At first, their conversations were strictly professional, clinical questions, logistical arrangements, but gradually, something shifted. One afternoon, as Haley waited for the doctor, Mason arrived early and took the seat across from her. How are you holding up? He asked, his voice neutral. Haley blinked, unsure how to answer. I'm fine, she said, almost reflexively. Mason leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. Fine is vague, Haley. Are you tired? Anxious? The directness of the question surprised her. She hesitated, then decided on honesty. Both, she admitted. And a little displaced. Displaced? She gestured vaguely around her. This place, your staff, the constant monitoring, it's so different from my life before. It doesn't feel real. Mason studied her for a moment, then nodded, as though filing her words away. He didn't offer reassurances or platitudes, but something in his expression softened. The first ultrasound, where the baby's heartbeats were audible, was scheduled for the following week. Haley sat on the examination table, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her blouse. Mason's arrival coincided with the technician's entry, his presence permeating the room like a peaceful tempest. The gel on her stomach was Kadi, and Haley shivered involuntarily. The technician adjusted the wand, and the monitor flickered to life. A rapid, rhythmic thudding filled the room. That's baby A's heartbeat, the technician said with a small smile. She moved the wand slightly. And here's baby B. The second heartbeat was just as steady, a duet of life echoing through the small room. Haley's eyes welled with tears as she stared at the screen. Despite everything, the isolation, the guilt, the fear, this moment felt profound. She glanced at Mason. His expression was uncharacteristically vulnerable, his eyes fixed on the screen with an intensity she hadn't seen before. His hand rested on the back of the chair beside him, his knuckles white. "They're strong," the technician added. Mason didn't reply, but the flicker of awe in his features was unmistakable. For the first time, Haley saw something in him that resembled wonder. That evening, Mason insisted Haley attend a dinner at the main house. "It's necessary to maintain appearances," he had said, his tone brooking no argument. The dining room was as imposing as the rest of the estate, with a long mahogany table set for an intimate group of Mason's business associates. Haley, dressed in a simple navy dress provided by Stephanie, felt painfully out of place among the polished and effortlessly glamorous guests. The first half of the evening passed in a blur of polite smiles and half-hearted conversations. Haley mostly kept to herself, sipping water and trying to ignore the curious glances from across the table. It wasn't until dessert was served that the whispers began. "She's the surrogate," one woman murmured to another, her tone low but laced with derision. "I mean, look at her. Hardly the type you'd expect for someone like Mason." The other woman laughed softly. He probably picked her because she wouldn't ask questions. Quiet and obedient. Convenient, really. Haley's cheeks burned. She stared at her plate, her grip tightening around her fork. The words weren't new. She'd imagined them 100 times in her head, but hearing them spoken aloud felt like a slap. When the dinner ended, she waited until the guests had left before confronting Mason in the foyer. "Was this necessary?" she asked, her voice low but edged with anger. Mason turned, surprised by her tone. "What are you talking about?" "Your guests," she said, her voice trembling. "The way they looked at me. The way they talked about me. Do you even care what this feels like for me?" Mason's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "You treat me like I'm just another item on your to-do list," she continued, her words spilling out in a rush. "I'm not a person to you. I'm just useful." His gaze darkened, but he didn't interrupt. When she finished, her chest heaving, he took a step closer. "Haley," he said, his voice quieter than she expected, "I didn't ask you to do this lightly. I'm not pretending this is easy for either of us, but I do care." "Do you?" she challenged, her eyes glistening. For a moment, Mason looked as though he might say something else, but instead, he nodded once. "I'll handle it," he said simply, before walking away. Haley stood alone in the grand foyer, the weight of the evening pressing down on her. She didn't know if she believed him. The silence in the guest house felt heavier after that evening. Haley sat at her desk, the cool breeze from the open window brushing against her skin. Her pen hovered above the blank page of her notebook, but for the first time in weeks, the words wouldn't come. She had always been able to write to Billy, to pour her fears, her guilt, and her hopes into those pages. But now, something unspoken lingered, a fracture in her certainty. Mason's words kept replaying in her mind. "I do care." But did he? The first sign of change came a few days later. A knock at the door startled Haley from her thoughts. Stephanie entered, carrying a small stack of books. "These are from Mr. Powell," Stephanie said, setting them on the table. "He thought you might enjoy them." Haley blinked, surprised. She picked up the top book, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. She had mentioned it once, offhandedly, during one of Mason's visits. She thumbed through the pages, the faint scent of aged paper filling the air. "Thank you," Haley said softly, though Stephanie was already leaving. She turned the books over in her hands, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and unease. It was such a small gesture, but it didn't fit the Mason she thought she knew. We would love to know if our listeners have had their own lovely babies yet. If so, please comment milk. If not, please write hope. We would love to send you some peace wishes. Now, we continue listening to this story. His visits grew more frequent after that. They were still formal, his words clipped and efficient, but there was a shift. He no longer stayed on the edges of the room, watching like an overseer. Instead, he sat across from her, occasionally leaning forward, asking questions that felt less rehearsed. "How did you meet your husband?" he asked one afternoon. Haley hesitated, surprised by the question. She could have dismissed it, kept it brief, but something in Mason's tone made her pause. "At a bookstore," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "He was trying to impress me by pretending to know everything about Hemingway. He didn't realize I worked there and had already caught him mixing up the titles." Mason raised an eyebrow. "And you gave him a second chance after that?" "He was persistent," Haley replied, her smile fading slightly, "and kind. He always made me feel like the most important person in the room." Mason didn't respond immediately. His gaze dropped to the floor, as though weighing her words. Haley's own feelings grew more tangled as time went on. The resentment she had felt toward Mason was softening, replaced by something she couldn't quite define. Respect. Understanding. She hated herself for it. That night, she wrote another letter to Billy. The pen trembled in her hand as she confessed the conflict within her. "Billy, I don't know how to explain this. Mason isn't what I thought he was. He's not kind. Not in the way you are. But he's trying. And that terrifies me, because part of me doesn't want to hate him anymore. And I'm afraid of what that means." She folded the letter carefully, placing it with the others. The act felt heavier than usual, as though sealing a secret she didn't want to admit even to herself. The pivotal moment arrived unanticipatedly. Mason arrived at the guest house late one evening, long after the staff had gone home. Haley was curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her legs, when the knock startled her. When she opened the door, Mason stood there, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. This time, he looked unsure. "May I come in?" he asked. She stepped aside, watching as he entered, his usual precision replaced by something almost hesitant. He didn't sit, instead pacing the length of the room before finally stopping near the window. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice quiet. "About how I see people. About how I see you." Haley didn't respond, letting the silence stretch between them. "You're right," he continued. "I've always treated relationships, people, as transactions. It's what I was taught. My parents. They made it clear that emotions were liabilities, that trust was dangerous." His voice faltered, and for a moment he seemed lost in a memory. "My father," he said finally, "once told me that the only thing you can rely on is control. If you control the situation, the people, the outcome, you'll never lose." Haley's breath caught. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. "I've spent my entire life living by that rule," Mason admitted, "and it's cost me more than I care to admit." For the first time, Haley saw him, not as the untouchable businessman, but as a man shaped by loneliness and fear. "You don't have to live like that," she said softly. Mason turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "Maybe not, but I don't know how to change." The vulnerability in his voice was startling. Haley stepped closer, her own walls beginning to crumble. "Change isn't easy," she said, "but it's possible if you let yourself try." Mason nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible smile crossing his lips. For a moment, the room felt warmer. the space between them smaller. As he left that night, Haley sat by the window, watching his silhouette retreat toward the main house. She realized, with a strange mix of fear and hope, that Mason wasn't the only one changing. One night, the contractions came suddenly, sharp and relentless, jolting Haley awake in the quiet of the night. She clutched her stomach. The sheet twisted in her fingers as waves of pain rippled through her. "Stephanie," she gasped, reaching for the phone on her nightstand. But as her hand closed around it, another contraction gripped her, leaving her breathless. She barely managed to press the call button before she collapsed back against the pillows. Mason arrived before the ambulance, his typically composed demeanor fractured by a mixture of concern and urgency. He strode into the guest house, his tie loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, a stark contrast to his usual precision. "Haley," he said, his voice taut. He crouched beside her, his hand hovering awkwardly over her arm, as if unsure whether to touch her. "Hospital," she managed to say, her face pale and glistening with sweat. "They're on their way," Mason said, glancing over his shoulder as if willing the paramedics to appear. When another contraction hit, Haley cried out, her hand shooting out to grip his sleeve. For a moment, Mason froze, his eyes wide. Then, as if breaking through an invisible barrier, he wrapped his hand over hers. "You'll be fine," he said, his voice steadier now. "Just hold on." The journey to the hospital was a hazy memory. Mason rode in the ambulance with her, his presence an anchor in the chaos. He barked questions at the paramedics, his usual calm replaced by something closer to panic. Upon arriving at the hospital, the doctors and nurses ushered her into a delivery room, while Mason stood in the hallway, pacing akin to a caged animal. Hours later, the cries of two newborns filled the room, their voices piercing yet beautiful. Haley lay exhausted but euphoric, her eyes welling with tears as the nurse placed the tiny bundles in her arms. "Simon," she whispered, gazing at the boy's scrunched-up face. She turned to the girl, whose dark eyes blinked up at her. "And Kelly." The world beyond the room momentarily vanished. All the fear, the guilt, the uncertainty melted away, replaced by a love so fierce it took her breath away. But the moment didn't last. Mason entered, his expression unreadable. He stood at the edge of the room, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "It's time," the nurse said gently, reaching for the babies. "No," Haley said instinctively, pulling them closer. The nurse hesitated, her gaze flicking to Mason. "Haley," Mason said softly. "We agreed." Her arms trembled as she held the babies, her heart breaking with every second. She kissed Simon's forehead, then Kelly's, her tears falling onto their soft cheeks. "Be good," she whispered. "Be strong." She let them go, her arms suddenly feeling unbearably empty. Mason approached the nurse, his movements slow, almost hesitant. He looked down at the babies, his usually sharp features softening as he reached out, his hand brushing against Simon's tiny fist. For a brief moment, their eyes met, Haley's filled with anguish, Mason's with something she couldn't quite name. "Thank you," he said quietly. Haley turned her face away, unable to watch as he walked out of the room with Simon and Kelly. The check was waiting for her when she returned to the guest house, neatly folded in an envelope on the dining table. She stared at it for a long time, the numbers blurring through her tears. It was enough, more than enough, to pay for Billy's treatment, to give him the chance he needed. But it didn't feel like enough. The next morning, Haley packed her belongings into the same small suitcase she'd arrived with. Stephanie came to see her off, her polite smile betraying a hint of pity. "Mr. Powell asked me to remind you that if you need anything, you can contact him directly," Stephanie said. Haley nodded, unable to find her voice. The apartment felt smaller than she remembered, its walls closing in around her. She placed the envelope on the kitchen counter and sank onto the couch, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. It was flat now, her body already beginning to forget. But she wouldn't forget. That night, she sat at the table, her notebook open in front of her. The words came slowly, her pen moving haltingly across the page. "Billy, they're beautiful. You would love them. I wish you could have seen them. I wish I could have kept them. But this was for you. For us. I hope someday you'll understand." She folded the letter carefully, placing it in the drawer with the others. But this time, it didn't bring the comfort it usually did. She sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the sounds of the city outside. Somewhere, Simon and Kelly were beginning their lives, and she wasn't there to see it. She told herself it was for the best. But the ache in her chest said otherwise. It's been a long time since she visited Billy. Haley sat on the edge of the hospital bed, her fingers lightly brushing Billy's hand. His skin was warm, but unresponsive, the steady hum of the ventilator filling the room like a monotonous reminder of time slipping by. The faint antiseptic smell of the room mingled with the low beeping of the heart monitor, making the silence feel heavier. "I miss you," she whispered, her voice trembling as tears pricked her eyes. She stared at his face, still and peaceful, as if he were merely sleeping. But 3 years of waiting had taught her otherwise. He wasn't going to stir, wasn't going to answer. Her throat tightened as she forced herself to continue. I found a way," she said, clutching his hand tightly. "We have the money for the surgery now. You're going to get better, Billy. You're going to wake up and—" Her voice cracked, and she broke off, her chest heaving with suppressed sobs. Finally, she whispered, "I'm sorry." Her tears spilled over, trailing down her cheeks as she leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his hand. "I'm so sorry. For what I had to do, for what I gave up. I hope you'll forgive me someday." The room remained silent, the machines offering no solace. The stillness of his body felt like a cruel weight, pressing on her chest. "I need you to come back to me," she whispered, her voice almost pleading. "Please." Haley stayed there for a long time, the silence of the room, her only companion. The call came on a quiet evening, the kind where the silence felt louder than the city outside. Haley sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the open envelope in front of her. The check sat untouched, a symbol of both salvation and loss. Her phone buzzed, the vibration startling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Mason Powell. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the accept button. Finally, she answered. "Haley." Mason's voice came through, steady and composed, but with a note of urgency beneath it. "What is it?" she asked, her voice brittle. "I've been researching," he began. "There's a neurosurgical center in Switzerland, one of the best in the world. They've developed a new procedure for cases like Billy's." Her breath caught, her hand tightening around the phone. "I've already contacted them," Mason continued. "They've reviewed Billy's case and are confident they can help. I've arranged for the surgery. All expenses are covered." Haley's grip on the phone faltered, and she had to steady herself against the table. You paid for it?" "Yes," Mason said simply. "The money I gave you is yours to keep. Use it to maintain your life, but don't worry about the hospital costs. This is already taken care of." For a moment, she couldn't speak. The words tangled in her throat as a wave of gratitude and disbelief washed over her. "Why would you do this?" she finally managed to ask. There was a pause on the other end. When Mason spoke again, his voice was softer. "Because I can. and because it's the right thing to do. Haley swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to spill over. "Thank you," she whispered. "You'll need to leave for Zurich immediately," Mason added. "The hospital is expecting you." The hospital in Switzerland was as pristine and modern as Mason had described. Haley sat in the waiting room, the polished white walls and sleek furniture doing little to ease her anxiety. The scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint hum of machines from down the hall. Billy was in surgery. The words felt surreal, as though they belonged to someone else's life. She clutched the edge of her seat, her knuckles white, her heart pounding in her chest. The doctors had explained the procedure, a groundbreaking method involving neural stimulation and advanced imaging. The risks were high, but the potential reward was immeasurable. Hours passed, each one stretching endlessly. The sound of footsteps or the faint murmur of voices would jolt her upright, only for her to sink back into her seat when they weren't for her. Finally, a doctor emerged, his expression calm but unreadable. Haley stood, her legs unsteady. "The procedure was successful," he said, his words measured but kind. "Billy is stable. It will take time, but we expect him to regain consciousness within the week." Haley's knees nearly gave out, and she had to grip the back of the chair for support. Relief flooded her, warm and overwhelming, and she managed a tearful "Thank you." A week later, Haley sat at Billy's bedside, her hand resting lightly over his. The room was quiet, except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. His face looked more peaceful than it had in years, the lines of pain and tension softening with each passing day. Then, as if summoned by her silent prayers, his eyelids fluttered. "Billy," she whispered, leaning forward. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, but gradually finding hers. "Haley?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible, but it was his. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. "I'm here." Billy's gaze shifted, taking in his surroundings. Confusion clouded his features, but he didn't let go of her hand. "What happened?" he croaked. Haley hesitated, her heart twisting. This was the moment she had dreaded, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. "You were in an accident," she began, her voice trembling. "You've been unwell for a long time, but you're better now. You're going to be okay." Billy nodded faintly, his eyes searching hers. "How? How did we afford this?" Haley looked down, her free hand fidgeting with the edge of her scarf. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. Over the next hour, she told him everything. The contract with Mason, the surrogacy, the birth of Simon and Kelly. She didn't spare herself, laying bare every decision, every moment of guilt and sacrifice. When she finished, Billy was silent. His eyes were glassy, his expression a mix of pain and something she couldn't quite identify. "I did it for you," she said, her voice breaking, "to give you a chance to live. I'm so sorry." Billy exhaled shakily, his hand tightening around hers. "Haley," he said, his voice rough but steady, "I'm not angry. I don't know how to feel yet, but I know this. You gave up everything for me. I could never hate you for that." Haley let out a sob, relief flooding her as she buried her face in his shoulder. They stayed like that for a long time, the weight of the past slowly giving way to the fragile hope of the future. For the first time in years, Haley felt something close to peace. The salty breeze swept through the open window, carrying with it the distant cry of seagulls and the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. Haley stood on the porch of their small, whitewashed cottage in Bar Harbor, Maine, watching the morning sun cast golden rays over the endless expanse of ocean. It had been 3 months since Billy had woken up, and they had decided to leave the chaos of New York behind. This town, with its quaint streets and serene beauty, felt like the perfect place to start over. Behind her, the wooden floor creaked softly as Billy walked in from the kitchen, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He sat one on the porch railing next to her and leaned against the frame of the door. "Thinking about something?" he asked, his voice still raspy, but stronger than before. Hayley wrapped her hands around the mug, the warmth spreading through her fingers. "Just how quiet it is here. It feels like another world." Billy smiled faintly, his gaze following hers out to the ocean. "That's why I like it. Feels like we can finally breathe." They had spent weeks settling into their new life, unpacking boxes, exploring the small coastal town, and falling into a new routine. Hayley had taken up part-time work at the local library, while Billy focused on his recovery, attending therapy sessions in the nearby city. The scars of their past still lingered, unspoken but present in the quiet moments. Hayley often caught herself watching Billy as he read or rested, her chest tightening with both gratitude and guilt. He had forgiven her, but she hadn't yet learned to forgive herself. One evening, as the sky turned shades of lavender and orange, they sat together on the porch swing, sharing a blanket against the cool breeze. Billy's hand rested on hers, his thumb absently tracing circles on her skin. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice breaking the stillness. "About what?" "About us. About everything you did to get me here." He turned to face her, his blue eyes steady. "You gave up so much, Hayley. And I want to make sure you know, I see that. I feel that." She looked away, her eyes misting. "I don't know if I'll ever stop feeling like I failed you. She hesitated, her voice dropping. "Like I gave away pieces of myself I can never get back." Billy's grip tightened on her hand. "You didn't fail me. You saved me. And if I can, I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that we're still whole, that we can be happy again." Her lips trembled, but she managed a small nod. "I want that too." Their days in Bar Harbor were simple, but fulfilling. Hayley found peace in the quiet moments, tending to the small garden behind their house, walking along the shore at sunset, or sitting by the window with a book as the rain pattered softly outside. Billy, too, seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. He joined a local sailing club, finding joy in the open water, and even started volunteering at the town's community center. The town embraced them, offering warmth and kindness that felt foreign after the sterile, transactional world they had left behind. Hayley often marveled at how quickly Bar Harbor had begun to feel like home. One afternoon, as they strolled along the rocky shoreline, Billy paused, picking up a smooth, flat stone. "Do you ever think about them?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. Hayley stopped, her breath catching. She knew exactly who he meant. "Every day," she admitted. "I wonder what they're like, if they're happy, if they're safe." Billy skipped the stone across the water, watching it bounce twice before sinking. "I think they're okay," he said after a moment. "Because of you. Because you made sure they would be." Hayley turned to him, her heart swelling with a mix of sadness and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as the waves lapped against the shore. For the first time in years, Hayley felt like they were no longer just surviving. They were healing. Together, they had begun to rebuild, their love growing stronger in the cracks of what had once been broken. And in Bar Harbor, with the ocean as their witness, they found hope in the promise of a new beginning. The gentle clang of the bell above the inn's door broke the mid-morning stillness. Hayley glanced up from behind the reception desk, where she was sorting through reservation cards, her hands moving with practiced ease. Got it? Billy called out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel as he stepped into the cozy lobby. The scent of freshly baked scones lingered in the air, mingling with the faint brine of the sea. The last 4 years, the inn had been their dream realized. A small, charming business nestled near the cliffs of Bar Harbor. Its white clapboard exterior and weathered blue shutters had become a beacon for travelers seeking peace by the shore. Haley and Billy poured their hearts into its upkeep, from the homemade breakfasts to the wildflowers tucked into vases in each room. "Morning rush is done," Billy said, leaning on the counter with a smile. "Time for us to breathe." When the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway caught their attention, Haley smiled back at him. A sleek black car pulled up, incongruous against the quaint charm of the inn. Billy frowned, straightening. Not a local car. Haley felt a sudden stillness in her chest. As the car door opened, Mason Powell stepped out, the morning sun glinting off his tailored suit. He turned to help 2 children out of the back seat, a boy and a girl, their small hands slipping into his as they stood beside him. The sight of Simon and Kelly stole Haley's breath. Mason approached the door with his usual composed gait, but there was something softer in his expression as he caught Haley's gaze through the glass. She opened the door slowly, her heart pounding. "Mason," she said, her voice a mix of surprise and caution. "Haley," he replied. His eyes flicked to Billy, who stood at her side. "Billy." "Powell," Billy said evenly, giving him a small nod. Mason gestured to the children, who were peering curiously up at the couple. "These are Simon and Kelly. We were passing through and—" His voice faltered slightly, the usually unshakable Mason Powell searching for words. "I thought it would be good for them to meet. Friends of mine." Haley's throat tightened as her gaze swept over the twins. Simon had her eyes, a warm hazel that reflected curiosity, while Kelly's dark curls reminded her of Billy's tousled hair in their younger years. "Hello," Haley managed, crouching slightly to meet their eyes. "It's nice to meet you." Kelly offered a shy smile, her hand gripping Mason's tightly. "Hi," she said softly. Simon, bolder, stepped forward. "Do you live here?" Haley nodded, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. "Yes, we do." "Would you like to see the garden? We have flowers, and even a little swing out back." Both children's faces lit up, and Mason released their hands, his watchful gaze lingering on Haley as the twins wandered toward the back door. Billy moved to guide them, his own expression unreadable. Mason stayed behind, his posture stiff. Haley turned to him, her hands trembling slightly as she crossed her arms. "Why now?" "They're old enough to understand more about the world," Mason said quietly. "And I thought you deserved this, even if they'll never know the full truth." Her breath hitched, and she glanced toward the garden, where Billy was gently pushing the swing as Kelly giggled. Simon was crouched by the flowers, his small hands delicately inspecting a daisy. "Thank you," she uttered, her voice barely audible. Mason looked away, his gaze distant. "I didn't know how much I'd feel seeing them here, with you. It's right, even if it's not what I imagined." Haley's voice softened. "They're wonderful, Mason. You've done well." His lips twitched into a faint smile. "So have you." Later, as the children played, Mason and Billy sat together on the porch, the sea breeze ruffling their hair. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Billy broke the silence. "I never thought I'd have a chance to thank you," he said, his tone earnest. "Not just for the surgery, but for everything you've done for Haley. For us." Mason's gaze remained on the horizon. "You don't owe me thanks. Haley, She gave me more than I could ever repay. Billy nodded, his expression thoughtful. You could have made things harder. You didn't. Mason glanced at him, his usual stoicism softening. She fought for you. I only gave her the tools. You're lucky, Billy. Don't forget that. I won't, Billy said firmly. As Mason and the children prepared to leave, Haley knelt once more to say goodbye. Kelly wrapped her arms around her neck, and Haley held her tightly, blinking back tears. Simon offered a small wave, his bright smile searing itself into her heart. Mason stood by the car, watching the quiet exchange. As Haley rose, their eyes met one last time. Take care, Haley, he said simply. You too, Mason. The car pulled away, the sound of its tires fading into the coastal wind. Haley and Billy stood side by side, watching until it disappeared down the road. For the first time, Haley felt something close to closure. Not perfect, but enough to move forward. Beside her, Billy took her hand, his grip steady. They'll be okay, he said softly. Haley nodded, her heart heavy, but hopeful. So will we. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting golden hues across the ocean as Haley and Billy stood on the porch of their inn. The distant sound of Simon and Kelly's laughter lingered in the air, blending with the rhythmic crashing of waves against the shore. Mason's car was gone now, swallowed by the winding coastal roads, yet his presence remained, a quiet echo in the space they had shared for a fleeting moment. Haley leaned against Billy's shoulder, her fingers laced with his. She whispered, I didn't think I'd ever see them again. Billy squeezed her hand. And now you have. That's something. She closed her eyes, replaying the memory of Simon's curious gaze and Kelly's shy embrace. They're happy, Billy. I could see it in their eyes. Mason, he's done a good job. He has, Billy agreed, his tone steady. He tilted his head to look at her. But so have you. You gave them a chance to be here, to exist. Don't forget that. Haley swallowed the lump in her throat, a faint smile breaking through her lingering sadness. I think I needed to see them to believe that. Inside the car, Mason drove in silence, the hum of the engine, the only sound breaking the stillness. Simon and Kelly sat in the back seat, chattering softly about the garden and the swing. Mason caught glimpses of their joy in the rearview mirror, their laughter a balm to the ache he hadn't realized he still carried. He had always prided himself on being a man of control, yet this experience had unraveled parts of him he thought unshakable. Haley's unwavering strength, Billy's quiet resilience, and the innocence of Simon and Kelly, they had shown him a version of life he had never dared to consider. As the road curved along the cliffs, Mason allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He would always remain apart from their story, a shadow on the periphery. But he was content with that. He had done his part, and knowing they were safe, happy, and whole was enough. It had been a long time. Mason felt a flicker of peace. Back at the inn, Haley and Billy lingered on the porch as the last light of day faded into twilight. The air grew cooler, but they didn't move, content to stay in the moment. Billy glanced at her, his smile soft. We've come a long way, haven't we? Haley nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Farther than I ever thought we could. He pulled her closer, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. Let's keep going, together. She leaned into him, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and hope. Always. The waves rolled on, steady and unending, carrying the promise of a new day. For Haley and Billy, the future stretched ahead, a blank canvas waiting to be filled with love, laughter, and the quiet beauty of a life rebuilt. After enduring the challenges, they were finally prepared to proceed. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.